welcome to this Avo Basics webinar. This is the first webinar in our series that we will be conducting for the, for the foreseeable future. So this one is focused on just the really basic concepts about Avo, the workflow, and then we will have more deep dive sessions later on that are to be scheduled. They're deep dive sessions on both the data design part of Avo and also another one for the implementation part of Avo. So if you're a developer, you might be interested in the implementation part. If you are a data person or a product person, you might be interested in the data design deep dive. I'm just gonna throw up a little poll here to understand who you are or what your role is. So please share with me what fields you work in approximately. Nice, got a bunch of responses. I'm gonna keep it up for a little bit longer. So the agenda today is, first I'm going to just tell you a little bit about who I am and why I am facilitating this webinar. Then I'm going to talk about the challenge at hand. So why teams often turn to Avo, what problems that they are trying to solve. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about how Avo addresses the challenge at hand. Go through the workflow. So we're going to go into the product and I'm going to just demo the workflow, but I would also love for you to follow along, because when you follow along, you're going to be able to understand much, be able to ask more meaningful questions. So the results from the poll are in. We have a lot of data people, product people, and engineering, some marketing, some other. Great, thank you for sharing. Oh, I was not going to click that button. Stop sharing. Okay, I was in the agenda. Let's continue with that. Yeah, so we're going to go through the workflow, and I would love for you to follow along so you can ask me some tough questions. I really want this to be a little bit more interactive than just me talking. So feel free to use the Q&A section in the webinar thingy, and Lex is going to help me make sure that I answer questions while I am going through this. So please, feel free to use that as much as you want. Then I also have the key concept that I showed you in the beginning, but those that missed that, I will have that there in the end, and I will share this with you as well afterwards. So I have the emails of all of you, so I will share the deck with you afterwards so you can have access to the key concepts. Then also going to share with you a little bit more about the upcoming workshops and webinars. But let's get started. So who am I and why am I here? So my name is Thora. I am leading customer success at Avo. My background is in data science. So I have lived and breathed product analytics since the year 2014. So I have been involved in defining a bunch of tracking plans, both for the companies that I'm working with and also helping other customers of Avo or people that I'm consulting establishing their tracking plans. So I'm super familiar with all the challenges that I'm going to talk about, and I'm really passionate about solving these challenges for the world, and particularly help our customers do that by using Avo and get value out of Avo. So what is the challenge? See that sweaty emoji. We're trying to become a little bit more happy when we are by using Avo. So this is kind of a high-level overview of a typical analytics workflow. It will definitely vary a little bit between companies, but this is kind of summarizing how it is for a lot of companies that we have talked to. So the first part, or the part number 0 here, is to just decide product changes. And that can happen in various different tools. Everyone has their own tool to document things. It could be Jira, it could be Google Sheets, Asana, Notion, whatever you're using. So that is usually the first step and first like the trigger of defining the analytics for a new feature or some product changes. Then what happens is that teams have another tool or another place to define their metrics and event structure. Typically, we see that happening in Google Sheet. Some teams have something like a JSON format, but yeah, the most usual one that we see is a Google Sheet. Then you go into another tool to get feedback and request implementation. You ping someone on Slack, or you ping someone on Jira, or there's a conversation happening in Jira. And this is all separated with your tracking plan that is perhaps lives in Google Sheets. And then a developer comes in, they implement the tracking calls in code. And these are usually direct calls to whatever analytics tool that they're using. So it's going to look like something like analytics.track, and then there's a bunch of strings in that analytics call. And it's super easy to make mistakes there. It's really easy to make typos in strings, have different types of properties. It's really easy to have inconsistencies between products, platforms, or even just code paths within each platform. So this is often a challenge for teams. And then when the developer has implemented, then usually there is some verification or validation that happens. There's someone that uses their eyes to compare the event stream in the analytics tool to the definitions that was made in the Google Sheet or JSON or wherever that happens in step 1. And this is, of course, pretty error prone, and there is no connection between the definitions in code and the definitions in the Google Sheet. And then teams go ahead and analyze their tracking in their tools, in the analytics tools. So this is basically, a typical workflow, and there are a bunch of challenges here. So what we have seen teams trying to solve with this workflow is these points here. This is kind of a summary of the challenges that teams have that we are talking to and have been talking to in the past. So one is just to make it easy to figure out what to track and strive to track meaningful data. It's so easy to just decide to track everything, every button click, every page view, every screen view, all interactions, but then it's so easy to get lost in all the data that you have. Then teams are often looking to improve the overview over their events and properties and what they mean. So basically to make it accessible to more people than those that are always working in their tracking plan. So this Google Sheet, it gets out of sync, like this point here. And it's really easy to have things missing there. So there's like a lack of source of truth, and that is a huge pain point for teams. Then another thing is to enable non-technical people to design data that provides clear implementation specs for developers. So the teams that have a JSON schema, they have really clear implementation specs for developers, but it's not really accessible for non-technical people. And then if you have a Google Sheet, it's really accessible for non-technical people, but the implementation specs are not going to be very clear for developers. So there is a gap there and often friction between those different stakeholders. Then what teams are often looking to do also is to improve the efficiency in workflows and communication between product, data, and engineering, which are typical stakeholders in the data. There are the engineers that produce the data. They actually implement the calls that send the data into the analytics platforms. And then there are the people that have an opinion of how it should be structured and what should be tracked. Then another one is to prevent new and discover existing inconsistencies and duplicates between all of these things, platforms, products, or just code paths. And then there is the manual QA. So reduce the need of someone using their eyes to compare what is actually being tracked and then how you want it to be. So this is a summary of the challenge. So there are a bunch of different things. Some teams have 1 or 2 or 3 of these challenges. Some have all of them. So what I'm going to do next is to actually show you how Avo is addressing these challenges. And then we will go into exactly how the workflow works. So how does it work? Please, if you have any questions, drop them in the Q&A sections. I really want questions. I need questions. Okay. So Avo is a collaborative single source of truth tracking plan with instant validation of correct implementation and automatic regression monitoring. This is a really big sentence, so I'm going to break it down a little bit what this all means. So we looked at a kind of workflow like this for teams that are not using Avo. Here's how it looks like for teams that are using Avo. So the first step, again, is to decide product changes. This is still the same. People are doing this in their tools where they are writing pitches or writing product specs. But then the next 4 steps, they happen in Avo. You can see that the numbers are pink here. So instead of jumping between tools and having communication in one place and the tracking plan in another place and the code separated from all of that, then we're consolidating that into a workflow and trying to make it more efficient. So the first step there is that you define the metrics and event structures in Avo. So you have a workflow there, a branched workflow where you can create like a playground or a draft state of your suggested changes and do that in Avo. So there are, you can be working on multiple changes to a track plan at the same time without affecting each other. Then you get feedback and request implementation in Avo as well. So the conversation is happening at the same place as the changes are happening. So there is like a diff view in Avo, and you can have a conversation about the diff. And then you can also share the implementation details and share them in a wherever your project management is happening. So in Jira, in Slack, in Asana, or anything like that. So it's possible to copy a human readable markdown about the implementation instructions. And this is usable whether you're using Avo to implement your events or not. So some teams are even just looking to Avo and using Avo for the first 2 steps. They're not really using the Avo functions, as we call them, so the generated tracking code, but they're just using Avo to manage the tracking plan, and then share the implementation details with developers on a consistent manner. Okay, then the third step, if you choose to use the Avo functions, then a developer comes in and generates code based on the definitions on the branch in Avo. So there is a function per event, and each of these functions are type safe. And basically what developers can do is to auto-complete their way through sending those events, and they just have to add the correct values into the properties. I will show you this later. Then there is the validation, and this is immediate feedback that the developers get in a form of a debugger. And also there are logs, and if you have a compiled language, then your app just doesn't compile if your analytics is different from what they are defined in Avo. And then we also have what we call the inspector, which collects all the data that you're sending with or without Avo and surfaces issues that are detected by the inspector. So if there are any kind of inconsistencies in the data that you are seeing coming in, inconsistent to what it is defined in Avo, then that will be surfaced there. So there are like layers of validation that you get with Avo. And then, like before, you just analyze your data in your analytics tool. So yeah, this is the high-level workflow. We will go through steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 in detail in the product in a little bit, but I want to try to trigger some questions. Please drop them in the Q&A section while I have a sip of water. Okay, no questions yet. I expect that they will come later then. So the Avo workflow, what are we going to be doing? So I'm going to do like a little bit simplified version of iterating the tracking plan today, because this is the basics webinar and we're going to try to keep it just 45 minutes. So what we're going to be doing is first suggesting changes on a branch, like I mentioned in the little circular thingy. And on the branch, we're going to be creating a metric, we're going to be creating an event, and we're going to be adding a property to that event. Then we're going to review the changes that we made. We're going to look at how we share implementation instructions with the developer. Then we're going to add collaborators, implement the event in code, and validate. So let's get started. And I would love for you, if you have an account with Avo, I would love for you to join me in doing this. So just follow along, create a branch, create events and everything like that while I'm doing it. And I will try to go slowly and allow for you to ask some questions along the way. So open Avo now. Okay, so this here is a demo tracking plan in Avo. Some of you are probably familiar a little bit with how the tracking plan looks like in Avo, but I think some of you are not familiar at all. So I'm going to go through all the basics. So this is a list of all the events that are being sent for my product, which is a messaging platform. So we're taking Slack as an example here. So here we have some sign up events, then we have some messaging events, message sent, message received. You can add reactions to messages and some session events. And here is the product that we are using. This is like a fake sign up page for Slack. And you can already see here that there is an event that has been sent. This is the debugger. This is one of the validation tools that you have access to when you use Avo to implement the events. So when I add my email address here, then the email update event is triggered. Then I add my password here, and then my password update event is triggered, and then I click sign up, and then we get sign up complete. So here I'm working on my local computer. So this is my development environment, basically. Okay, so you are familiar with these 4 events because I just triggered them in the product. And you can see also here with the green dots that these were seen in development less than a minute ago. So I just triggered them, and then this implementation status is updated. So now I'm going to go through this this workflow here. So first I'm going to create a branch. So I do that by clicking here. Here we have the main branch, and that's what we're branching out of. So I click new branch, and I'm going to be adding a checkout flow to my product here, to my little sign up page here. Okay, so now we are on the checkout flow branch, and this branch is in draft state. So now I can just play around. I can make changes without affecting anyone else. So the first thing that we usually recommend doing is to define metrics. And the metrics are helpful to help decide what to track, to help you define meaningful data. So instead of, just adding some events, I'm first asking the question and deciding I need these events to be able to answer those questions. So I'm going to add a checkout funnel here from starting a session to completing checkout, all the typos. So I'm going to add my checkout funnel to the checkout category. I'm going to stick with the metric type funnel. There are other metric types. If you're familiar with analytics tools like Mixpanel and Amplitude, these would be really familiar for you because these are kind of very common metrics that can be used there. So now I'm going to add some events to my checkout funnel. And the first event, I'm just going to start with starting a session. So when I click here, you can see that the first thing that happens is that my existing events, all the events from my event library, they pop up here. So the default behavior is to use existing events. So I'm going to look for my session events, and I can see I have 3 session events: session end, session start, and session refresh. And I'm going to use the session start one. Okay, now I've added that event to my funnel. Then I'm going to add cart update. There is no such thing as cart and nothing with update that's related to cart. So I will just go ahead and create that event since I didn't find an existing event called cart update. So now notice that I have typed this event differently than session start, and this is really common for teams that don't have any have a good source of truth for their events and don't have any validation for the implementation. It's really common for just the casing to be inconsistent between especially platforms, because there is some platforms that like snake case, another platform that likes camel case, so it's going to be a total mess. So I can just use the suggestion from Avo because Avo knows what my dominant casing is, so then they can suggest which casing I should use. So then I create this event, and I am going to add a description. We really recommend adding descriptions to the events because this is the key for consistency of when the event is sent. There is a lot of difference, and there are a lot of things that can happen from when a button is clicked to the action successfully being finished, especially with checking out. There's a credit card that can be declined and all kinds of stuff. So I'm going to be adding here the description, sent when the item has successfully been added to cart. So now all the developers that are going to implement this event, they are going to be aligned when this event is supposed to be sent, because this description is also translated into code. And I will show you that a little bit later when we start the implementation piece. And then here I'm going to decide where this event is supposed to be sent from which platform. So our web platform, they are ready to send this cart update event, and our iOS platform as well. So I'm going to add those here. And here you can see also where this event is going to be sent to. So this is configurable here in the connections tab, where which platform is going to send the events to which destinations or analytics tools. Okay, so the next step is to add some properties. So the same thing here as when I was defining events, the same thing happens here. The default behavior is to use existing properties. So when I want to know which product is being added to the cart, then I can just look for my product properties. And here are all the 4 existing product properties. And here are also a product info property group that contains all of these product properties here. So here you can see that we have the product ID, product name, product type, and product price. This helps me never forget, never forget the product ID. That's really easy to forget if you have like a group of properties that are often on the same events. It's really easy to forget one of those. I could also just add one property at a time, and I'm going to do that now because I'm going to be implementing this event, and I don't want to take too long to implement all of the properties. So here I've added the product type property, and if we look into that a little bit, then we can see that it has a description as well. It has a type. So Avo helps you stick to the consistent type consistent types of your properties. It's going to be a pain if you have your event data in a database and you have different types of 2 different properties. It's going to be really painful to consolidate that. You have to create a view or something to consolidate that. Then you can define when this event should be sent. Is it always sent, or so it's required, or is it sometimes sent, so it's optional, or it can also be sent depending on a source. I'm not going to go deeper into that now. That we will cover that in our deep dive session. And then also with the properties, you can define these rules or constraints. And for the string properties, you can define exactly which strings are allowed. Because the same as with event names and property names, when you have multiple different versions of the same property or event, same with the property values, you always have to aggregate all of these different versions. If you have, for example, umbrella with a lowercase u, umbrella with only a single L, then I always have to add these 3 property types, the property values together to know how many people are looking at umbrellas in my store. So yeah, so this is how a property is configured, high level. And let's go out of that. So I've configured my event with a description, where it's sent from, where it's sent to, with a property. And here you can also see the metric is right here. So the metric is connected to the event. I hope that someone is following me in defining events and properties in your tracking plan. Let me know if you have any questions. Then I'm going to also add another event to finish my funnel. So checkout complete. I'm not going to configure that. I'm just going to add it to send it from the web source. I'm not going to configure it more because we don't really have time to go into too much details. Okay, so now I have created my checkout funnel here, and it has 3 events, and I've configured the cart update property. So now we finished this step here, and now we're going to review the changes that we just made. So to do that, you go into this part here, by your branch name, and click View Changes. And then you can see here is a summary of the difference between this branch and the main branch. So here you can see that I've added my metric to the checkout category. I've added my checkout funnel, and here's all the new parts that I added to that. Then we can see a cart update. This is a new event. I added my session start event to the checkout funnel, and then I also added a checkout complete event. Okay, I'm pretty happy with this, but now I want to get a review from my coworkers and my peers. So I want to add them as collaborators. So for example, Sölvi, he is a web developer, and I want him to review this event from a developer perspective. And then Sarah here, she is a data person. I, as a product manager, I just suggested these events, but I want someone from data to also review and see if everything makes sense. Okay, so now they have been added as collaborators, and now they will be notified about the conversation that happens on this branch, and also when my branch changes status. So now I can have, have a conversation. I want to ask Sölvi, do these properties make sense? And he will be notified because I'm mentioning him, but also all the collaborators will be notified because there's a conversation happening on a branch where they are collaborators. Okay, and then we can just mark it as ready for review. So now I have said I'm finished playing around. I have suggested my changes, and I want Sölvi and Sarah to review these changes. They could come in here and approve my changes, or they could request changes if they have any comments. So Avo provides collaboration, approval workflows, and review workflows as well. I would love if there's anyone that has questions to go ahead and ask them. I have my Q&A open here, so feel free to ask. There are no stupid questions. Okay. How do we create a property group? Thank you. I'm going to do here answer live. So let's do that. So in the properties tab here, then there is a kind of a section for property groups. So here are all the existing property groups that I have, and then I can do add group here. I can give it a name, and then I can either add existing properties to that group or create new properties within that group. Hope that answered your question. Okay, if you have more questions, go ahead, throw them in. I'm happy to answer. Wait, I have a question. Nice. Does Avo provide some default properties with the event? This is a great question. Answer live. So there are default properties. So Avo does not provide any default properties beyond what the analytics platforms provide. So, for example, if you have the revenue tracking. So let's say you're using Amplitude and you add the log revenue action here. I will not go really deeply into this in this session. We will go deeply into actions in the deep dive session. But just to touch on this, for example, if you do log revenue here, then Avo will prompt you to provide the default properties for revenue, which are, for example, currency and price and stuff like that for Amplitude. Hope that answered your question. Nice. Edit events in bulk. That is a great question as well. So editing events in bulk is not possible right now, but keep an eye on our product development because it might be coming soon. Nice. Happy with questions. Please keep them coming. I will continue with my workflow and you just can drop in anytime. So now I'm going to pretend to be Sölvi, our web developer. So what he wants to do, I was going to also show you the implementation instructions. So here, Avo generates implementation instructions based on the events and properties that have been defined in Avo. So this is just a markdown text of the changes compared to the main branch. So this can just be pasted into Jira, and this will be nice and human readable in Jira because they support Markdown. And these implementation instructions can be used with or without the Avo functions that I'm going to show you a little bit later. I have a question here. Is it possible to download the events and properties in bulk? Yes, you can. So in the connections tab here, you can, no, not connections, in the publish tab here, you can create integrations, and these integrations provide CSVs or JSON of your taxonomy. So for example, the mixed panel lexicon here, this contains a CSV, no, a JSON of the events and properties. The amplitude one here, that contains a CSV of your events and properties, and this you can import into sheets and play with it whatever, however you like there. Also, there's a webhook, so you can publish your tracking plan to any of these services here, Amplitude Govern, Mixed Panel Lexicon, as segment protocols. And also, if you have, you know, some internal ingestion time validation, you can publish your tracking plan there and use the tracking plan from Avo to validate ingestion time or do whatever you want with your tracking plan. I answered live. Boom. Thank you for your questions. Great. Yeah, so this can be, the implementation instructions can be shared with developers and they can just use these to see which events and properties they are supposed to update. So here, for example, there's a new event, cart update. They can just copy paste this with or without using the Avo functions. Okay, but if I wanted to use the Avo functions and I am Sölvi now, the developer, then I would go in here and see which changes are affected to my source. So I am looking at the web source here, and I can see that the cart update event and the checkout complete event are affected by my changes. So this is kind of a checklist for me to understand which changes I need to implement. And this here is a command for our command line interface. So if you're a developer, you're very familiar with that. But if not, then you will see here how that works. So now we are in my development environment. So here's the code for my sign-up page that you saw before. And here's my command line. And I can just paste this command here. And what's happening now is that my avo.js file here is being updated, and there are functions being added for my cart update event and for my checkout complete event. So what I can do now, and this is something that we will deep dive when we do the implementation deep dive session. So I'm not going to go into the code here and all the steps. I'm just going to show you briefly how it works. So avo.cart update. So my cart update event has now been provided as a function in Avo.js that I can just call here. And if I send this event here without any properties, I'm going to show you how that works. So here you can see I've sent this event here and something is missing, and now Avo is screaming at me. So I can see here product type. Product type should be of type string. Basically, this thing is telling me that this product type property is missing. You can see also here when I hover over the function, then you can see here I was going to point at the screen, but you don't see what I'm pointing at. You can see here the description of the event and also the properties that are included in this event. Just a side note connecting to the description being translated into code. Okay, let's add my product type property then. And one of the values was mug. But here I can see that I did something wrong. I provided the product type property now, but I provided a property value that was not defined and that was not allowed in my property. So I should have spelled this with an uppercase M. So we can simply do that, just change this to an uppercase M, and my event is sent correctly. So everything is good now. Or I could also use a variable that product type that, no, not this one, that Avo generates for me as well as the functions. So I can just do like this. So now Avo, because Avo knows which string values are allowed, they can just create a variable for me, and then I don't have to type it, and I can just do it right the first time. So cart update, product type is mug, and the event is being sent correctly. Okay, then let's take a look at how we have progressed. Now you can see 1 out of 3 events have been implemented. And within web, I have checked out my first event, the cart update event. So this is the workflow that I wanted to share with you today. Now I've gone through all of these steps. I didn't go through, because in this, actually here, in this workflow, I shared with you the inspector as well as another form of validation tool. I haven't dug into that here, but we will dig into that in future sessions. Let's make this full screen. So just to summarize a little bit how this connects to, you know, deciding your product changes. So the first step, deciding product changes, you do that as you normally do in whatever tool you're using. Then you go into Avo and do the next 4 steps, defining metrics and event structures. You get feedback and request implementation, and you can share that in any of these tools where the product changes are defined. Then app developer generates code. They validate the implementation and make sure it's according to the specs that were made in Avo initially. And then, as normal, you analyze in your analytics tool. So I also wanted to share with you, please continue to add questions. We have 2 minutes left of our time here. How do I install the Avo Events Debugger plugin? So the debugger here, this thing here, so this comes with when you initialize Avo. So if you go into our documentation and look for Avo 101 for developers, that provides detailed answers of this. I can maybe, oops. I can maybe share the.
I dropped it in there, Thora.
Nice, thank you, Lex. So the Q&A section thing went away. Oh well, I hope you are managing it. Oh, it's here now. Can you specify regex for validation of properties? This is a great question. So this is a fairly popular feature request that we have. We don't have support for regex right now, or regex, or however you say it, but hopefully soon. I'm not able to tell you a timeline, but you know it will happen at some point. I can promise you that. Enter live, done, boom. Great questions, really great questions. Yeah, upcoming webinars and workshops. So tomorrow, Lex here, which is co-hosting this with me, is going to host a how to track your next release workshop with it, which is a part of our Avo community, the Right Track community. I really recommend checking that out. So if you go to the righttrack.avo.app, you can find all the information about that. And then coming soon are the deep dive webinars that I've been talking about a few times. So keep your eyes on our notifications. I will share them with all of, like when we have scheduled those, I will share the registration with all of you that registered to this webinar, so you can take a look at that if you're interested, both at this data design and implementation. And then in the end, we have the key concepts again. We're at time, perfect timing. I have a last question here, perhaps. Any plans for Jira integration in the future? This is a really great question. So this thing here is our first step towards Jira integration. So this was kind of the lowest hanging fruit that we could do to enable teams to get the implementation instructions into Jira. But here's some copy pasting obviously required. We are planning on doing a Jira integration, but when it will be, I am not sure. So yes, short answer. So great. Thank you so much for attending. I will hang out for maybe a few more minutes if you want to type in any more questions. Otherwise, I will follow up with an email with the resources that I told you about in the beginning. And I hope this was useful for you. If you have any feedback, either about this webinar or the product itself, I would love to hear from you. Send me a line in the community Slack or the Right Track Slack, I mean, or you have my email address. Please feel free to reach out. Thank you so much.